this is more of an open discussion, right? And I think this is going to be a multi-part series where we talk a little bit about, and I'm not sure who is playing around with that.
Oh, sorry, that was my mistake. Sorry, let me.
That's okay. We talk about the war economy in different facets. So for today, for example, we will focus on Cameroon government, their budget, the funding of their budget, because that is also particularly relevant to certain situations going on, which we would talk about. But in the future, we will also open that up, right? I think we would also talk about our side, certain aspects of the war economy, how it affects us, how maybe some of our more nefarious brethren may be profiteering from it, and that may be hindering our steps towards Biya, but also ways in which we could use economic warfare, both in terms of alleviating the suffering of our people and in terms of increasing the pressure on La République as a means of hastening our pathway to ending this war favorably for us, right? And when we think about this last part, what comes to mind is think about one of the reasons Afghanistan was able to survive 20 years, or at least the Taliban in Afghanistan was able to survive 20 years. We don't want to copy a lot of things they did, but one of the things they did was they were able to keep the local economy in the areas they controlled vibrant. Now, they did it in ways that, once again, I will not recommend we copy, right? But we have to look for ways in which we keep our own economy vibrant, because if our people are not suffering, if our people are well fed, if people are economically strong, then they will outlast the occupation. They will have the patience and the stamina to outlast the occupation, right? And that will be a discussion for another time as we find weeks in which we have the opportunity to open it up. But today, today's discussion would focus on La République and particularly its budget. Generally, if I'm looking at numbers here, so we can start, I'll throw out some broad numbers, and then I will throw out some of the sources of those numbers, right? And then we would narrow in on the ones that we can affect. So Cameroon's budget, 2023 budget is somewhere around 6 billion CFA, which is around $10 billion, right? So it's just a little under $10 billion. Most of its revenues come from oil tax and literally donations from friendly countries, right? And that makes up just 4.5 billion CFA. So in general, Cameroon projects budgetary deficit of already 1.5 billion before starting. Now, I think they find different ways in which they intend to raise this, right? And we will come to that in a second. But a lot of the ability to get this comes from their internal revenue. It comes from donations, and by the way, donations, which is, ought for a country to budget on donations, essentially gifts from other countries as a budgetary item. But the ability now, I think, if we see this year, I believe fiscal stamp has gone from, what was it, from 500 to 3,000 or something, I think, or was it from 500 to 1.5? It was more than 100% increase, right? Which is essentially more than 100% increase in fiscal taxes. I believe gas prices, petrol prices are also set to go up to make up some of that. But a vast majority of that would now come from both the IMF and to some extent the World Bank, right? So Cameroon has what the excuse me, what the IMF usually would call special drawing rights, which is essentially what your quote-unquote shares in the IMF give you access to. As think about it as your credit card. When you have a credit card, you have a credit limit, and you can use without much purview that credit limit. So as a member of IMF, Cameroon's SDR, which is special drawing rights, entitles them to 130 million, which you and I know they generally run through very quickly. That generally can get opted to 270, would be a quota they can take, right? But outside of that, they have access to other IMF loans and grants, right? And from that, they have pooled $1 billion. Then you have the World Bank also. Right now, World Bank data is a little bit, how do I call it? Iffy in the sense that sometimes, and I can actually, let me see. Oh, right. No, that is per year, right? But technically, when I give the one for the for the SDR is per year, but the loan is what they have accumulated, right, to cover. And so I can actually share my screen instead of just running through numbers. Let me share my screen, then we can open up some discussion on that. And I'm going to share. So that is quickly 2000, end of 2022 numbers for Cameroon in terms of external debt. Here, if you start looking at what we are interested in is the multilateral, and then also the IBED and IDA would pretty much be World Bank and IMF. Total multilateral debt, 20 billion, 1.3 billion, IMF, 8 billion, World Bank. The other ones, private creditors, bilateral, that is, bilateral will be like what they borrow from France, what they borrow from the US or China. The US doesn't usually give as much bilateral debt. This would mostly be China. The bilateral debt is mostly China. It's not, does not show up in the multilateral, right? So let me stop that. I want us just to see those numbers. And how much they pull by year 2022 is not yet in, but you can see how much Cameroon budget is being supported by either IMF, World Bank, or multilateral lending. Their $10 billion US budget, at least 20, but upwards of 30% would have to be supported, at least. Why is that important? That is important because let's start with China. Cameroon didn't get much from China last year. I doubt they'll get much this year. China is changing its lending practices to African countries. It's not that it's not as generous. It is beginning to look at fiscal discipline. And Cameroon came close to default. I don't know if you guys remember, we actually talked about this in summer 2021. Cameroon had close to 600 million due China that it could not pay. Now, that I think got restructured. I haven't been able to find the terms of that restructuring yet. That has not been, it generally doesn't get made public, but there are ways in which you can find out. We have not been able to find that out yet. But what we do know is China has really not extended any credit to Cameroon since. So we know that China seems to be a dry well for Cameroon. France covered Cameroon the end of last year, to cover Cameroon's fiscal hole last year. So it is left for pretty much to the Bretton Woods institutions, the US and Western nations to likely cover what would be 20 to 30% of Cameroon's budget this year. Most of us listening or on Zoom live in those nations. How do we stop them? Right? And in town hall hour last week, we talked a little bit about it. Now let me stop there. I don't know if anybody wants to chime in before I continue with what is almost a monologue.
Thank you, Professor Ndofor. We ask that people put their hands up so we can identify them. Or write comments.
Yeah, okay, yes, or write comments. I'll be looking at chat. And I don't know, Francis, if you can watch Facebook for me in case any questions or comments are coming in through Facebook, that would be great. Now, the IMF, a couple of weeks ago, put out a statement regarding its review of Cameroon, right? Essentially, the country level review for, I believe, a second tranche of loans is done. That was for, if I am correct, that was for 75 million, right? So IMF and Cameroon reached $75 million staff level agreement. Now, this is once again outside of Cameroon's special drawing right. So Cameroon usually exhausts that immediately, right? So this is for an extended, this is part of that what they'll call extended credit facility. So it's essentially a loan. The problem with this is for Cameroon to get access to this money now, it has to go to the World Bank Executive Board. Not the World Bank, excuse me, the IMF. The way the IMF works is, it is not the director of the IMF who makes the decision. It is not the country level. The IMF has a 24-person executive board that meets and votes to approve access to the credit facility or not. Right? So the staff would make their recommendation. Now, I would almost say, luckily for us, this is not, and I'm going to share this screen, although I have no clue which screen this is. You know what? I'll share that screen. This is supposed to be the, Arthur, is the screen showing clearly? I think I got it. My screen is the chat. You are muted. Is the chat showing clearly?
Yeah, we have a pie chart. There's a pie chart that is showing.
Okay, good. I hope it's clear.
But I would say make it large, just so that because we're seeing the go to a presentation mode.
Okay. Is that better?
Much better.
Now, the IMF is not one person, one vote, right? The executive board of the IMF, you vote based on how you have contributed capital to the IMF. And as you can see there, guess who has contributed the largest capital to the IMF? The US. So the US alone controls 16%. The US representative sitting on the IMF, that 24%, their one vote they cast counts for 16%. Japan counts for 5.9, Germany 5.8, France 4.8, all the way down. You can see how the math for this quickly adds up. If we want to stop Cameroon getting additional disbursements, what do we need? Well, there is Canada and the US that gives us 20% already. But if Canada comes, if the US and Canada go along, you know, you likely get Japan, Germany, and UK. You're at 35%. That already puts problems for Cameroon, irrespective of what France does now. Because it is tradition that France generally gets the IMF directorship, doesn't mean that they have a lot of sway. They still have just 4.8% vote, which is a fraction of what the US carries. Right. So one of the things we need to start thinking about, and by the way, the executive board meets in 2.5 weeks, right? So it meets towards the end of the first week of March, so in 2 weeks. Can we target certain countries? So for the US, it technically, the person who sits, the IMF director representing the US, reports to the treasuries. It's appointed by the president, confirmed by Senate. Her appointment is still pending Senate confirmation, but she sits there, right? So it's an executive appointment. But technically, she reports to the Treasury Secretary. So could we contact the Treasury Secretary? Could we have a lobby campaign, a writing campaign to the Treasury Secretary and the US IMF Executive Director, right? She goes by the title of Executive Director. Could we do the same for the Canadians? By the way, Canada shares, if you notice, there are more countries than 24 seats. So countries share a seat. So Canada shares one seat with 5 other countries. So the vote cast by the Canadian is not going to be just 3.9%. It is actually going to go closer to 10%, because Canada shares, it has the largest, but it shares a seat with 5 other countries. The US has a seat by itself. Germany shares with 3 other European countries, UK with a few, France with a few. So once again, we target these key countries, we will likely get 50%. We will likely be able to stop if we're successful. What will it do to Cameroon if we can take off 10, 20% of their budget? Quite honestly, by us actively campaigning, using just their inability to show up for Canada, can that give momentum enough for us to say, and this is what we mean by multilateralism, right? By the way, and you see, as North Korean talks go, if you had US, Japan, Germany, if you are picking countries that have to be there on the table, I'll use the word, you can use the word witness, you can use the word observer, but at a high level to be enforcers, this is where you look at. Because these are countries that can essentially freeze Cameroon out financially. You bring in Japan, you bring in Germany. You know, France will be there by default, by proxy. And so if France is there by proxy, well, UK too will be there by proxy. So the people you'll be debating would be Germany and Japan and the US. But you're looking at how they control the Bretton Woods institutions. We turn to World Bank. World Bank is quite interesting because World Bank does 2 things. World Bank essentially also acts as your, what would we call it? Like your Equifax, right, for nations. They don't actually call it Equifax, but if World Bank gives you a clean bill of health, then you're more likely to get bilateral and multilateral loans. If World Bank does not give you a clean bill of health, then you're unlikely to get those. So World Bank facilitates lots of other loan packages. The US usually appoints the World Bank director, while France appoints the IMF director. Now, unlike the IMF, the World Bank director has a lot of power. The IMF, it's the executive board that really controls. Last week, the World Bank director tendered his resignation, right? Partly because, if we all remember, it's a Trump appointee, and it also signals what Treasury Secretary Yellen has been talking about a lot, the need for World Bank to get proactive in certain things with its policy, to use its lending and to use its financial muscle to be proactive in achieving known financial objectives. And I would clearly think that our situation is one of those situations. Now, I know broadly speaking, they were thinking of other situations, but we can clearly make the case, if we are concerted in our lobbying, that our situation fits squarely as a known financial situation where the bank's leverage can affect. And for that, the US doesn't have to do much. The US doesn't have to consult. They don't need to ask for lots of votes. The US controls the director, and the director sets the policy, right? So the director is resigning to give the chance to the Biden administration to appoint their own person so he or she can set the agenda for the next 5 years. Now, we don't yet know who that appointee will be, but it is once again an area where we could likely start gearing up and thinking about ways in which we can get our case and strategize ways in which we can get a policy where the bank or the US can leverage the bank to get Cameroon to succumb to international pressure, right? So let me stop there a little bit so I don't end up doing a very long monologue, and open it up for others to comment, ask questions, or throw in other suggestions.
Thank you very much, Prof. Herman, for that very, very eloquent discussion. You have done two things. You have educated us a lot on how these financial institutions that are supporting La République work, and a lot of the intrigues and the background, which a lot of our people do not understand. Thank you for that. And you've also given us reason to understand how diplomacy works. So diplomacy is not only about a country calling us for talks. Diplomacy also entails these kinds of interactions and networking, which our people don't do. They complain about diplomacy, and then when it is talks, that's where everybody thinks that diplomacy happens. I remember a couple of years ago, I think the Takumbang and some other women wrote a letter to the IMF, which got a response trying to block one of those loans, extra loans beyond their drawing rights to La République. But I think that if those kinds of efforts are sustained, then that's when we'll begin to make a dent. But my question to you, because I know when the IMF, even the executive board, issues these kinds of loans, they always ask countries to undertake certain reforms, all these IMF restructuring reforms. And my understanding was that Cameroon met some of the KPIs, those key performances indexes. I know, for example, that Biya took away some of the subsidies. They had asked the government of Cameroon to cut back on its expenses. Biya took subsidies away from things like petrol. I know that one of the things that hastened Biya's conviction and confiscation of Mebengo's properties was his own way of telling them that he's fighting corruption. So I don't know if you can speak to these smokescreen activities Biya undertakes to impress the IMF and to meet those demands of the IMF. I would also suspect that some of the people rounded up in this Martin Zogo investigation are people we know have embezzled huge sums of money. Can you speak to some of those domestic activities Biya tries to undertake to meet these IMF KPIs?
Yes. So, you know, most of what IMF would look at would be economic indicators, right? So IMF is not going to look at political indicators. IMF is not going to tell you to release political prisoners or hold an election, a free and fair election. IMF is not going to tell you to respect human rights or grant independence or allow Southern Cameroon score. IMF will look at inflation. It would look at subsidies. It would look at privatization. Yes, it would look at, I don't want to use the word, they will not use the word corruption, right? They would use, they will use probably a better word would be budget management. Right. So when they think about the key things they look at, they would have set metrics. And while I'm not too familiar with the metrics, not all of it is public. I guarantee that inflation would be one. Budget to debt ratio or GDP to debt ratio, so that would be level of indebtedness, might be another. But although they always include that, that is one criteria that always gets waived, because all these countries, their debt ratio is going up, not down, right? We just saw Cameroon, it's going up. They are borrowing every year, not paying down. Then, and this is where now Cameroon and most African countries have pretty much privatized most things that could be privatized or that anybody has interest in buying, right? And that would have been IMF and World Bank. So there is less of a push towards privatization now as there was maybe 30 years ago, when you had lots of state-run enterprises. So those would likely be the key things. World Bank, generally separate from IMF, will inspect the projects themselves, because some World Bank would push for initiative. For example, we do know that World Bank did push for the Bamenda Babaju Road several times, and that is why it kept being announced, but never really being built. So World Bank generally would actually inspect its own projects or the projects it funds to some extent, I would say. But you're not going to find IMF, you're not going to find known economic indicators. Where you can insert that would be what we are saying. You can insert that at the executive board level to determine their vote whether or not grant access to credit facility.
Sorry, I'm muted. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yes, that is where you can find that. And in that case, they are not publicly talking about it, or they are not publicly listing it as a condition. It's just determining their vote.
Okay. So, which means other than us lobbying, because I know, for example, they would ask Biya to cut, expenses, and then he would remove subsidies to show that, he's contracting expenditures and things like that. So other than the lobbying, there is nothing else we can do as far as extending the lines of credit. Are you saying the IMF does not also look at the political stability in the country? In our case, an ongoing war?
No, the IMF, I don't know if that's the IMF or World Bank. I think it's the World Bank that does the classification, right? The economic, and the World Bank has not yet classified us, which is, I mean, it's one of the odd things, but these classifications are not independent. Let me put it that way. Last I checked, the World Bank has not classified us as a fragile economy or a war economy. I think it's the World Bank that does that classification. And yes, because that comes with implications. For example, businesses can declare force majeure on their contracts. And nobody wants that, because nobody knows or whether they'll be on the receiving end of that. Right? I think we all know what force majeure is. Almost most businesses, especially multinationals, most businesses, multinationals, extractives, have a clause, a force majeure clause, right? Those doing this, if you're an oil company or you're doing major contracts with the government, that you cannot be held to any obligation on that contract if there is an act of war going on. Now, other things are mentioned, right? Acts of nature, but generally war is the biggest one. And so if it is declared to be a war economy, and the World Bank does that, it carries lots of legal implications for both Cameroon, but also the West, the multinational corporations doing business in Cameroon. And I don't think the World Bank wants that. Now, that would be great for us. I think it should be. And it is where I think it is where one of the things where, if you guys remember, Professor Roberts did when he was last here, mentioned a bit of surprise at how much we, or the lack of rationale, and these are my words, not his. So let me now say, I'm now using my words, I'm not quoting him or establishing, so let me not. The lack of a lack of initiative in not containing the war within Southern Cameroon, right? Once you are attacked and you are at war, you are at liberty to defend yourself everywhere, as long as it is a legal military target. And when such targets that are constantly and routinely taken down in Southern Cameroon, if they were taken down rather in La République territory, then it becomes more and more likely that the World Bank and others may now classify it as a war zone. And La République now gets into trouble in lots of different ways, right? Not the least of which is lots of their contracts would get broken and companies will just walk away and declare force majeure. They'll stop paying La République, they'll stop meeting their own end of the obligations. And that is not something any government wants, right? So you have a multiplier effect if that happens. Now, if it is contained, no offense meant, I'm from Bamenda, but we all know that, and La République knows that's why it does it. They could put a nuclear bomb and blow Bamenda off the map, and the rest of the world will not care. Nobody would declare a major incident. We all know that. They can do that to Mamfe, and if we don't rise up and make noise about it, it will not even make a local newspaper headline that something happened. That is the reality of our situation. And so if we want things like this to occur, and it is a war economy, if we want the Cameroon government to also suffer the negative repercussions of running a war, then one of it is they have to be considered to be the war economy, but that doesn't occur if there is no war in La République, essentially, unfortunately.
That makes sense. That makes sense. So I think our appeal, therefore, should be for our diplomacy to include not just going for talks at the behest of La République, but for us to also have a focus on targeting some of these institutions and making, as you said, our situation understood and known by the larger international community. Because this is, what, 7 years going on now, and Biya has, we like to say, you know, it's yes, we are affecting the economy, but as you said, inflation is worldwide. So Biya may not necessarily see it as the war. We know that the European Union gave him 5 billion, not in budget assistance, but in support assistance, food, medicine, other humanitarian things they may need. And I think beyond this IMF, I think the EU also gave him another line of credit or a loan, a grant, something.
Yeah, no, France, I mentioned
France.
this, I don't think I gave the details. I remember France gave close to $300 million.
Yes.
Last year, that was going to cover through this year to cover Cameroon's part of Cameroon's budget.
Yes.
Right? So that is literally budget support.
Yes.
Nothing else, right? That goes into this year, straight up. So.
No, so I was saying we need to then have a more comprehensive diplomatic approach. Diplomacy, as I was saying, is not only waiting for La République to say they are going to come to a table, but we need to start to tighten some of these other angles that would also force La République's hand. Because 7 years going, as you've said, we think La République is affected financially. I think their bigger problem is embezzlement, and not so much that run or done properly, Paul Biya will not continue to sustain his government. As far as I see, all that money which is being stolen left and right is the problem, and not that we are putting enough economic squeeze. On the contrary, I don't know what you think, what your opinion is.
Yeah, there is no question that irrespective of how much economic squeeze we think we are putting, whether it is 0 or it is 10, more economic squeeze is always better, right? So I don't think we should even have the debate whether or not we are putting economic squeeze. The issue is more is better. And so the question we should be tackling is how much more economic squeeze can we put? Let the people on ground 0 and ground 1 do their part. Those of us who are not in ground 0 and ground 1 should also do our part, right? It is both what we call push and pull. The people in ground 0 and ground 1 create expenditure for La République. And we out here, we stop the flow of funds to La République. Both sides make sure that there is a big hole in La République's budget. And inability to fill that hole means no money for bullets, no money for tanks, no money to pay soldiers, disgruntled soldiers, civil servants not getting paid on time, even more disgruntled civil servants, more headache for La République, more strikes, more protests, all things that strengthen our hand because it's more fires for La République to be trying to be putting out, and it gives us, it distracts them such that we have more angles of attack. Right now, it is easier for La République to strain all its guns on us because it doesn't have that many fires to be putting out. But if it has more fires to put out, then we have more room to maneuver. And everybody has a role to play. If you're in the diaspora, well, and we will come back with more information on this, right? We will have, both in the town hall hour and this, we will have a draft letter that people can send. If you are in Europe, we'll have for your specific country and representative for the IMF executive, the IMF executive board. In Canada, we will have. In the US, we will have. Right? Just that alone doesn't take much effort, but we are going to eventually go beyond that. And I don't think we know all the answers, and it's one of those things we have to open the floor for deliberation to say what other ways in which we can push the economic warfare. And that is one side of the war we can all fight, whether you're ground 0 or in the diaspora. We can all fight that. You cannot say, well, you know, I can't take a gun and go fight because I'm not in ground 0.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Herman. I don't know if anybody else has a question for Prof Herman. Please just raise your hand and unmute yourself. If anybody has any questions or any further comments for Prof Herman on this subject.
A question.
Okay, go ahead, Master.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. How you've just analyzed the issues actually, but sometimes I really wonder, how do we go to actions? How do we approach some of these things so that they make meaning for us? I don't know. You talked about writing a letter that we can share, or is it better such activities not to discuss here? Or how do we, what are the things we could really do concretely so that there is something we can do to reduce what disadvantage they have over us? Yeah. I don't know.
No, you're right, man. Astara. Something like a letter we can discuss here. La République, knowing that we are writing letters to Secretary Yellen, doesn't change the effect of that letter.
Yeah.
And it doesn't give them the ability to preempt that letter. If they want, they can also write to Secretary Yellen, except that they are not Secretary Yellen's constituency. And the US ambassador cannot be writing to Secretary Yellen to dictate how the US should vote. So that part we can discuss. Are there other aspects that we probably should not discuss? Yes. Where we would need to decide and figure that out in closed doors. Yes, right. And that's why certain other things are more circumspect, right? So yes, that is one, but that is clearly not all. And once again, I don't know all. I think many people out there have ideas. We need to, all of it should not be discussed publicly, not here. I would say quite a few of them should not be discussed here.
Okay, thank you.
Especially and most definitely the ones that pertain to the push strategy, right? The ones that entail increasing La République's expenditure.
Okay.
Yeah, I get to add to Nastan's question. I actually have a question for Herman on the road, which is then should the secretariat then commit to, you had mentioned either Takumbel or HQ, should there be at least a commitment that the secretariat should get on with these groups and try to see if they can draft something that can go out from these multiple groups? Because I think something coming out, especially from the women's group, might also carry a lot of weight.
Yes, I think the women's group had sent a letter directly to the IMF. I think we will definitely follow up with them on this, and we will definitely work. I think Manasta is here, and I see some other Takumban women here. That there is no question. I see Marfo is also here. We can definitely work with Takumban in helping draft that if they want. But in this case now, we will be going directly to the voters, not because, you know, the IMF director does not have a say. The executive director of the IMF does not have a say whether this money gets disbursed or not. It's the executive board that votes. And so if 50% say no, it doesn't go, irrespective of what the executive director, who is French, want, right? So we target the decision makers. We target Canada, we target the US, we target Germany, we target Japan. We get those 4 countries and the seats they carry. Those 4 countries don't cross 50%, but because the seats they carry include other countries, their votes will cross 50%, right? So it's, IMF has about 192 member countries, but the executive board has only 24 seats. So for example, Cameroon is a member of IMF, but Cameroon doesn't have a seat. Cameroon doesn't sit there, but Cameroon is part of about 10 nations, 10 to 12 nations that share one seat. Now that seat votes only about 2%, some average 2 or 3%. Canada represents about 9%. Germany has about 4 other European countries. UK has a few. So those, because the seat they vote on represents more countries than their vote, they are voting more than their percentage. And so they can tip us over 50% if we can convince them. Now, even if we don't succeed this time, we get close, we may succeed next time, but they have our case and they will discuss it, and Cameroon will be on red alert. The France will be telling Cameroon, it's close this time, next time you may not make it through.
I agree with you, Prof. I don't think it should be, a one-time thing. This, I mean, in 2.5 weeks, I doubt, I don't know, let me not say, I don't know if we will get enough push, but it's something we have to be consistent at doing. Like you said, if we don't succeed this time, maybe next time or maybe the time after, we would succeed. But to your point, if our fighters on the ground, because they are the ones, have to increase the expenses for La République, then we have to find a way of helping and supporting them to do that, while we also now reduce the chances of La République securing what they need to secure to cover the gap of that expense. I totally agree. So that calls for a lot of work and a commitment from our people. So you were talking about a letter. Is that something that you and those working can put together? Let's share.
Yes, for that is not a problem. Yes, we can do that. That is clearly not a problem.
Okay, then we can reach out to the Takumbem group again, since they had done this before, to probably also step in and in this campaign.
Yeah, we can also reach out to SCA in Germany if we are talking about Germany.
Well, they're in their house, so
we can do the German version and
yes,
send it,
yes.
and we know where to send it to.
So I'm glad SCA is in the house. So SCA has more work to do. Yes, we'll definitely. Yes, because after US and Japan, Germany has the next largest, right? Germany is 5.8, and Germany controls. I can actually tell you what percentage the German vote would carry in a second.
I think you mentioned 5 point something earlier. 5.3.
Yeah, but that is what percentage Germany has, right? But the question is the vote. So Germany, actually, okay, Germany has a seat by itself. So Germany, US, China, and Japan are the countries that have a seat by themselves. So Germany would just vote its seat. Canada carries the seat. Canada shares its seat with an interesting collection of France also has a seat by itself. Okay, Canada gets the seat together with Antigua and Barbuda, Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, Dominica, Grenada, Ireland, Jamaica, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and Grenadine. So yeah, those are quite small.
Okay, so I think we are almost at the top of the hour. We are actually at the top of the hour, Professor Herman, and we have SCA with us. So I would like to thank you for this very educative and informative presentation. And we look forward to the campaign, which we should start with the IMF and possibly the World Bank. I don't think we have to wait till La République goes to the World Bank. One thing that has kept us, we're always, coming from behind, and we know these things, that these things will happen, and we should be more proactive. So I want to thank you for that very elaborate presentation. Hopefully our people understand better how these things work. This information is very useful. We have to be informed when we are taking care of a business like this. So I thank you very much for your presentation, and we look forward to the campaign letters and working with other organizations to help spread the word. So thank you very much, Professor Herman.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you.